Hi and welcome to the next quick tip video. If you've got this far, then you already have a good connection to your ECU with the Mighty tuning software. You've also loaded a base map, as well as check your I/O settings and do a sanity check on the analog sensors. The next step is to get an RPM signal into our ECU, and to do that we're going to head over to the Diagnostics tab. In here you have some readouts. You have the RPM, you have the synchronization status, and you have the two most important boxes here, the crank and cam IRQs. These boxes show literally signals coming in on the two pins. So regardless of what the engine settings are in the setup for this map, if you spin the engine over, these numbers should increase. If they do not, you have a hardware wiring issue or a sensor issue. So it's very important that you at least get these two numbers increasing. Of course, you might not be running a cam sensor, so in that case, don't worry about this one. Pay attention to the crank sensor. What we'll do is we'll open up the engine driver from the system here and move it over this way a little bit. And you can see that this base map is set for an ST170. It has a 36-1 crank sensor, as do all Z-Techs, and it has an ST170 teeth pattern on the cam. Now on the bench here, we only have the signal, a 36-1 signal, going into the crank wiring. So if I turn that generator on, you'll see something happening. Firstly, you can see that the crank interrupts are indeed counting up, but we're not getting RPM and we're not getting sync. This is because the internal algorithms of the ECU are indeed looking for a 36-1 trigger wheel, but they're also looking for the ST170 cam pattern, and as you can see here, there's no cam signal. So one of the first steps to do is to work on each sensor one at a time, and the way to do that is to turn the cam pattern to none. So if we turn that one off, and then power cycle the ECU, turn the ignition off, wait for the reconnection box to appear, and turn the ignition back on, you will see now that because we have the cam pattern set to none, we are indeed getting sync. We're getting our interrupts coming from our crank sensor, and we are of course getting an RPM. And if you were just running a standard Z-Tech and you wanted to run semi-sequentially, that would be where you would go from. That's it, it's done. Of course, if you're running an ST170, then you do need that ST170 signal. Now before we go any further, it's worth noting that we do have sync status here. However, if you still don't have crank sync status here, just on crank sensor alone, it's worth trying swapping the two pins that run into the crank sensor over, the blue and white wire. With them back to front, although you will get crank interrupts, you will not get sync. So if you get the interrupts, you have the trigger pattern set correctly, but you still don't get RPM, do try swapping over the blue and white wire within the crank signal. Once you have an accurate crank signal, the next step is to get the cam signal working. So again, set this to ST170, the box will turn green, and you will need to cycle power for the changes to take effect. So turn the ignition off, wait for the reconnect box, and turn it back on. Again, in this example you will see no sync because we don't have the ST170 pattern being fed into the ECU, but if we did, and we still didn't have sync and with these cam IRQs increasing, we would now try swapping the two wires running into the cam sensor. With everything in place, you will then receive an RPM, and you're then ready to move on to the next step, which is tuning. But at this point the engine may even spring into life. The injectors should be clicking and the coils should be firing. So it's worth checking some basics if the engine doesn't already run. Cheers.